It looks like we have a winner.
Jackpot.
Ah yes, Devil May Cry, the franchise that has spawned a multitude of top-tier games, excellent characters, and some of the funniest damn memes I've ever seen. Not only is it considered one of the most iconic gaming IPs to ever exist, but at this point, it might as well be my favorite alongside Doom and Kingdom Hearts. I mean, what's not to love about it? The slick, combo-oriented action, the beautifully fluid animations, the likable characters, its undeniable influence on hack and slashers, I could go on and on forever. DMC 3 and 5 are all among my all-time top 15 games and have pushed this series to insurmountable heights, making it damn near impossible to beat in terms of sheer quality. But all of this glory had to have started somewhere, right? Surely a franchise as huge as Devil May Cry must have had an origin in similar fashion, right? Built upon the remnants of an early build of Resident Evil 4, Devil May Cry arose from its metaphorical ashes and became an instant smash hit. Everybody wanted to get in on the action, and who could blame them? You literally take control of a smooth-talking son of a demon lord with a sexy red coat, killing hordes of demons as you go. Sure, it's not as stylish as later titles, but DMC 1 still holds up surprisingly well, even 20 years later, despite the obvious growing pains of what was a relatively new genre at the time. But just how does this game hold up after all these years? Well, you're about to find out.
Haha, time to go to work, guys.
Let me get this out of the way right off the bat. If you're expecting a whimsical, high-octane experience, then you may be a little disappointed here. Sure, there are the occasional moments of swagger, but the game mostly consists of slower-paced combat, with more gothic, atmospheric aesthetics, which shows the game's Resident Evil roots. And while the game still does have very solid and fun combat, it's hard to go back to after playing 3 and 5 so much. But anyway, enough of the borderline pointless comparisons. This game is still a hell of a lot of fun to play. The combat system consists of different combos that can be achieved with specifically timed button presses, which can be combined with special attacks that can cause your opponent serious damage. The special attacks such as the Alistair's High Time and Sinner are almost always satisfying to execute, and when successfully combined with other attacks to cause absolute devastation, you feel like the biggest badass in the world. You have a great amount of tools to your disposal, and mixing them up to see which one benefit me the most against certain enemies and bosses will never not be exciting. The developers implemented a ranking system that also encourages the player to utilize different attacks against their foes. The deadlier and more varied your combos are, the higher your ranking goes. There aren't many things I can name that are as satisfying as achieving a stylish rank in this game. The methodical combat system combined with amazing enemy design and gorgeously sinister settings make for a game you'll surely enjoy. Another thing I would love to mention is the weapon selection. 3 unique weapons make up your arsenal, as well as a multitude of devil arms. You get the Alistair and Ifrit as melee weapons, who have their own set of combos and abilities, and then you have the Devil Trigger. It gives you access to a ton of different attacks depending on what weapon you're using, which only furthers your combative options. With the Alistair equipped, you can perform lightning-based attacks such as the Air Raid and Vortex, and as for the Ifrit, you can hurl these big-ass fireballs at your opponents, straight up smoking them bitches like a brisket on a Sunday in July. I've never had brisket before, but I can only imagine just how tasty it is. Almost as tasty as this game's combat, I'm assuming. And while this game will surely deliver a fun time with its spectacular combat, there is still a plethora of flaws present. First things first, the camera. Much like the classic Resident Evil games, the camera is entirely made up of fixed angles that you have no control over. I normally wouldn't mind this, except the angles can be genuinely awful at times. When you're in smaller, more cramped spaces, you can barely get a look at just how many enemies are in the area, and it's not uncommon for enemies to take up the entire screen either. And in the outside, more open areas, Dante is so far away from the camera they can hardly be seen. I can't even imagine how stressful this was on the PS2 days on an old 2 TV. Thank God I got the HD version. I gotta be honest, outside of the whole Resident Evil connection, I genuinely don't understand why the developers went with fixed camera angles for a combat-heavy game such as this. See, with Resident Evil, the fixed angles work because you typically don't fight a ton of enemies at one time, while with Devil May Cry, you're constantly under threat from dozens of enemies at once, which can make the carnage more annoying than it needs to be. Sorry, but this type of camera system just simply doesn't work for a game like this. No wonder they finally fixed this issue at the third game, where it still had fixed angles, but also allowed you to rotate the camera freely. Had something like this been implemented in the game, the experience wouldn't be nearly as frustrating. And it's not like it was a hardware limitation or anything. Nearly every PS2 game had a fully analog camera. Hell, 2 analog sticks and PlayStation controllers had been a thing since a few years prior as well. There are really no excuses for this outside of, once again, the Resident Evil roots. This was just simply a bad game design decision through and through. The camera is typically pretty bad throughout the entire game, but during certain sections, such as the underwater levels, the Griffin boss fights, and the third Nightmare boss fight, are where the flaws of the camera shine the brightest. My god, Griffin isn't even in the field of view most of the time. Why the fuck would you pick fixed camera angles for a flying enemy? It's especially awful during the second encounter on that weird pirate ship thing, where you can't even see him at all, really. Of course, it's nowhere near as bad as the Untitled Chapter in DMC2, but it's still pretty excruciating nonetheless. Thank god I can just spam air raid against the fucker and take him out relatively easily. Speaking of bosses, the game has quite the repetition regarding boss fights. There are 4 unique bosses in the game and each of them get 3 different fights each. Why? I'm gonna be honest, the boss fights in this game are pretty weak, which is a shame because the base enemies are so good and fun to fight against. Well, almost all of them anyway. Nilo Angelo, however, is an amazing boss fight and simply one of the best in the entire series. Each fight feels like a genuine test of your skills, with each encounter being far more demanding than the last. As you get stronger, he gets stronger, and each of the 3 fights really showcase this. Fights like this have always been my favorite. No dumb pattern memorization, no gimmicks, none of that bullshit. It's a straightforward bout between 2 powerful forces just going all out against each other. Perfect. Phantom is an alright fight as well, nowhere near the level of Angelo, but I had a good time in each of his encounters. And then there's Griffin and Nightmare. Nightmare can feel pretty repetitive with the way you have to hit these light panel things over and over in order to attack him, but other than that, he isn't all that bad except for the third encounter. Speaking of which, his third and final fight, where the issues regarding the camera and lock-on system are at its most agitating. Seriously though, I keep trying to smack those light panels only for me to randomly swing my sword in the direction of Nightmare because apparently the lock-on is too fixated on something I can't even damage yet. And to top it all off, I keep getting bitch shapped around by these weird goopy things in the process. Fucking hell. Also, out of all the camera angles in the game, this one ought to be the worst, with the second Griffin encounter following closely behind. But hey, none of those bosses matter once you encounter the big boy. The big rocky space god of the underworld himself, Mundus. Mundus is quite the solid final boss. The second section is pretty weak and can be beaten pretty easily if you're using the Sparda sword, but the first space section is a lot of fun. The controls are pretty much perfect, and the fight itself is engaging as hell, with the way Mundus constantly mixes up his many range attacks. And now that I've gotten the general combat, camera, and boss fights out of the way, I would like to mention one more thing before I wrap up the gameplay category, and that's the level design. The level design is pretty solid most of the time, but at the same time, it can often feel pretty repetitive. A good chunk of the levels follow the same formula of, hey, go find this thing, put thing here, fight enemies between, rinse and repeat. While I wouldn't exactly call this a major flaw with the game, I just simply wish they mixed it up a bit instead of having nearly every level feel like an Easter egg hunt. Oh, and before I forget, why did the developers decide to include platforming sections in a game with a control scheme such as this? This type of control system is not suitable for platforming, like, at all. You do have a double jump, air hike, but it's unfortunately locked behind a pretty substantial amount of red orbs. Question, why would you lock a debatably essential mechanic behind a massive paywall? It's one of the most expensive upgrades in the entire game, like, what? All in all, this game is pretty solid gameplay despite its obvious shortcomings. The combat is fun, varied, and still impressive to this day. Mixing up attacks with the Alistor, Ifrit, and Devil Trigger would never not be a great source of entertainment for me. Had the game given you an analog camera, a more fleshed out lock-on system, and more variety in bosses, this game could have been a masterpiece for sure. But hey, the gameplay is still lots of fun, and I always find myself coming back for more of that sweet-ass action, even if I wind up dreading a good amount of what the game has to offer. Oh boy, this one's a stinker. Inconsistent tone, bad voice acting, the general plot going absolutely nowhere, etc. To be honest, I don't think the writers quite knew what they wanted this story to be. The first handful of cutscenes indicate something swagger-fueled or something, while the later cutscenes show something more dramatic. Like, by the second half of the game, Dante's cocky demeanor has virtually been sucked dry, and is replaced with a pseudo-heroic inspirational husk that would fit snugly in a shitty fanfic written by an 11-year-old on Wattpad who doesn't have a single grasp on how the English language works. Dante just feels like a completely different character as the story progresses, but hey, I'm sure the sequel could flesh out his character and keep his personality consistent. One could dream. Also, is anyone else bothered by the absolute lack of cutscenes, or is it just me? Anyway, while the story is inconsistent and all over the place, it doesn't even come close to the voice acting in terms of how awful they are. Like, we all know about the infamous "fill your dark soul with light" line.
I should have been the one to fill your dark soul with light!
That's not even the funniest line in the game.
I look like my mother, but you're nowhere close to her! You have no soul. You have the face, but you'll never have her fire!
What?
The sky is fair. It'll always be above everyone's head, no different.
What does that mean? Yeah, it's clear that this voice actor is more suited for bragging and not the more dramatic stuff, cause, yeah, the emotions are so phoned in and it's hard to take those particular lines seriously. As for Phantom, if it weren't for the subtitles, I had no fucking clue what this dude was saying. My dude sounds like a chain smoker yelling at the Walmart employee because he didn't carry his preferred brand of garbanzo beans. Garbanzo beans. And while I've been shitting hard on the story for the past couple of minutes, I want to give it at least some credit for this one scene that will never cease to send shivers down my spine.
Virgin, Dante, happy birthday.
Wow! I want chocolate! No, I want chocolate!
Man, that's cold as fuck. Yeah, there really isn't much more I can say about this game's story, considering it is pretty minuscule and weak. What little story that actually is offered suffers from being totally inconsistent, forgettable, or unintentionally comical. Yeah, just a very weak story overall. Okay, yeah, this is one slick-ass looking game. The atmosphere is legitimately the best in the entire series, even if it is vastly different compared to the other games. The art style is great, the gothic aesthetics are lovely, and the atmosphere, like I said before, is beautifully sinister. And even though this game mostly takes place on a single island, all the different areas you encounter would maybe lead you to believe otherwise. No two areas in this game look the same. Each and every location has their own unique look that keeps the game visually interesting and varied. Also, can we just take a moment to appreciate the grand magnificence of this castle? Wonder how long it took for the architects to build this big son of a bitch. I'm sorta iffy on how I feel about the underworld. I mean, yeah, it looks like quite the hellscape, I guess, but man, the underworld has been portrayed in much more interesting ways than this. This just looks lame. This game is nearly 20 years old, but despite that, it looks pretty good, and what really sells me about this game is the atmosphere. And I'll get more detailed with that in this upcoming category. God damn, now this is a soundtrack. One that balances the two strongest vibes in the game, the dark atmosphere of the castle and the underworld, as well as the kick-ass attitude of the combat. The exploration segments consist of this foreboding ambient music that is so elegantly combined with classical, which really accentuates the game's Victorian classic gothic aesthetic. running through this dark, seemingly abandoned castle with this eerie music droning on in the background really delivers this great sense of isolation, and I honestly love that. I get why people wouldn't like this, because it's a hack and slash game and you're supposed to feel like a badass the whole way through, but I beg to differ. The devs brilliantly molded the horror aspects of the Resident Evil games with this wicked sense of badassery that the Devil May Cry franchise is known for today. Oh, wait a minute. I'm supposed to be analyzing the soundtrack. How the fuck did I get so distracted? Anyway, on to the battle themes. Much like every other game from this era, Devil May Cry's battle themes are a cross between techno and metal music. And of course, I'm totally head over heels about it. This may sound kinda cheesy, but I feel like the soundtrack was made for me. Catchy metal guitar riffs with groovy drum programming and harsh electronic elements. I'll blare this shit any day of the week, twice on Sunday. We all know about the majesty of Public Enemy, or as listed on the OST, Pubic Enemy? I think that was a mistranslation. And of course, Lock and Load. My favorite track in the entire game has to go to Ultraviolet, the Nilo Angelo battle theme. That fucking riff. It's just so catchy. The first time I heard it, I had it stuck in my head forever. So yeah, banging ass soundtrack for sure. The only drawback is some of the organ music can sound a little too campy for my taste. But every other auditory piece of this game is absolutely brilliant though. Oh lordy, the lack of content in this game is sad. One playable character, 1 3 to 4 hour story mode, and a couple of secret missions. That's about it. Yeah, there really isn't much to write home about here unfortunately, since the story is terribly brief, and post-game content is basically non-existent. There are a bunch of different difficulties, but to be honest, should different difficulties really be considered extra content? I just wish there were more to do outside of a short story. Some minigames or something would have done nicely, but nah. We didn't get any of that until the sequel. Wow, something that DMC2 actually did better. On that note, I am seriously dreading that game. But I have to review, and it'll probably wind up being a funny review. Wouldn't make much sense to skip it. Anyway, while the game is really fun to play, I just wish more content existed outside of a single campaign. Imagine if Bloody Palace had been introduced in this game. How fucking cool would that have been? This one's going to be a very brief entry since, well, this game is pretty much perfect in terms of polish. Clean frame rate, no glitches, and the controls are pretty solid. For the time. I did mention that the lock-on system and camera are both pretty janky, but the latter was more or less a bad gameplay decision, and wasn't caused by a lack of polish. That same fortune cannot be held for the former, however. The game runs just as you would expect it to. If only the targeting system had been tweaked to where it wasn't so frustrating against certain enemies like Nightmare and some of the flying enemies, the polish would be pretty much perfect had that been the case. Very solid amount of replayability with this one. Whether you decide to progress onto higher difficulties or just simply start a new, clean file, I'm sure a couple more playthroughs wouldn't hurt you. I mean, it wouldn't hurt me, of course, I always come back to this game. Sure, later installments in the franchise sort of render this one almost redundant, but I still frequently come back to it. It just has a totally different vibe that the other games have, and I love it for that. Despite its drawbacks, Devil May Cry 1 is still a very solid game and is definitely fun enough to warrant 1 or 2 extra playthroughs. There are certain aspects of the game such as, once again, the Nightmare boss fights that I may dread, but it's nothing that's never going to prevent me from coming back, and I'm sure the majority of the player base would agree with me there. Devil May Cry 1 definitely showed its age, but nevertheless, it's still a great game and I recommend that you play it for reasons beyond historical significance. Sure, every DMC game that came after this besides if you ever wish to get into this glorious franchise, and I highly recommend you do by the way, I suggest you start off with this game. It does come up short in terms of camera, story, and content, and pretty much any other aspect of this game ranges from good to spectacular. The combat is superb, the atmosphere is brilliant, and the soundtrack is among the greatest of the PS2 era. Sure, it's old, it's relatively janky, and you're probably better off playing 3 through 5, but hey, For what it is, DMC1 is still a solid game and an essential piece of gaming history.
Okay, let's get it over with in 10 minutes. Can't let a single one of those suckers live.
5 minutes.
More than enough.